2 months into the second Trump administration, and the madness, confusion, and chaos has already begun at full force. As we look at the next 4 years, I want to create some filters for myself to figure out what to focus on and what to either ignore or defer. I've got things to do. You've got things to do. I don't want to obsess about every terrible thing Trump says or does, but I do want to be aware of and care about and speak out against things that have fundamentally concerning ramifications or consequences. And so in this video, what I want to talk about is some filters for the way that I'm approaching this in order to understand what to focus on, what to care about, and what to defer to others or simply ignore. At the end of the day, I'm a single person. I can only do so much. I do want to speak out against lies and corruption and things around the topics that I care about and that I'm educated about and that I understand. And at the same time, I want to be able to defer to others. This is not something that any of us are going to be able to do alone. We all have to come together. And I think that's a big part of this opportunity for us is by speaking out, speaking publicly. We have an opportunity to shine the light where it's darkest. As a Christian, that's particularly important to me. I'm both a Christian and a Republican. And when I look at the Republican Party, I look at Trump, I see a toxic and dark situation unfolding. The values and the vision and the virtues that I was taught and that I've come to know as a Christian are at odds with what I'm seeing unfold in my own political party, in the church, and in my country. And this is an opportunity for me to speak out and to share with you what I'm thinking, but also how I'm planning to navigate this dynamic that is confusing, that is overwhelming, that I may want to simply avoid, run away from, or just close my eyes altogether. And this is an opportunity for us to connect with others who may see and have the same concerns as us, the same values, the same vision, and that allows us to come together, to group together, and actually make an impact. Now, some of what I think is most important may be a little bit different for you, and we all have to focus on different things. And I think fundamentally, there is a foundation that we all need to care about. But on top of that foundation, there's going to be different things that each of us looks at, monitors, speaks out about. And so I want to talk just about what that is for me and encourage you to do the same. Get clarity, figure out what it is that matters to you, what you want to focus on. Because when things move and when they move rapidly and when chaos happens and when forces come at you that you were not expecting, it's very difficult to think and plan in the moment. Think through these things so that you're prepared for what's to come and you have ideas and plans in place on how you're going to respond. One of the things I want to share with you is a clip from an interview on the Share Life podcast. It's with Teresa M. Ward. Teresa shared this wonderful analogy, and I'm going to play the clip. And she talks about a boat and the waterline of the boat. That's one of the frameworks that I'm using to help navigate and make sense of this situation and how to respond to it.
There's a concept about the waterline. Okay, so you picture a ship and it's sitting in the water, and part of the hull is underneath the water and part of it is above. Failures that happen above the waterline are not going to sink the ship, right? So if you poke a hole in the side of the boat that's above the waterline, okay, this is inconvenient. We will patch it up with some duct tape or some tar or whatever, and we will sail on.
Yeah.
And I think it's important for leaders, mentors, to allow people to fail above the waterline. Now, if it's, hey, you're 22 and we're going to just fly you out to see our biggest client alone, unprepared. And if you mess up, you're going to ruin 70% of the company's revenue. Like, that's a below the waterline failure. So leaders should not set up their folks for that are really going to sink the ship.
It's the issues below the waterline that are most critical. Now, for each different issue, that's going to be different things. But as a country, as America, I've identified what I think of as that waterline, and I'll dive into that in just a little bit. What those things that damage the boat below the waterline that are so damaging is because they place a hole in the boat where the water then seeps and eventually sinks the boat, taking everyone in it. Over the last couple of years, I've been actively vocal as a Christian and as a Republican, vocalizing my concerns about Trump, the toxic nature of his leadership and his businesses and his presidency, and the toxic and negative effect that he's having in the church and in the Republican Party. He's reshaped the Republican Party and much of the Christian church in America in his image, which is the antithesis of who Christ is and what he came to do and what he came to model for us and the way of life that he's called us to live. And so as I've been politically active the last couple of years, I've taken this below the waterline approach. I believe that Trump is a uniquely below the waterline threat to our country, to the Republican Party, and to the church in America. And I'm concerned just about the damage he's already done that will take decades for us to recover from, but also the damage I expect that he's going to do over the next 4 years of his presidency. Going forward, clarity on our priorities is going to be essential for navigating the noise, not getting overwhelmed or burned out, and actually effectively making a difference in what we say and what we do in terms of our local community and any ripple effects that might have beyond that. So we have this below the waterline and above the waterline framework, thinking about what's important. The second thing to keep in mind, and this comes from another clip, I had a conversation with Margaret Heffernan. She did the famous TED Talk, Dare to Disagree, and I invited her on the podcast. And this interview came a few weeks after Trump won the 2024 presidential election. And it's really helpful because it gives us another way to focus our finite energy on what we can control and the ways that we can have an impact. So I'm going to play that clip and just give you a little insight into this other framework that you can use to help navigate the years ahead.
There was a very wonderful piece in The Guardian in the UK this weekend by Rebecca Solnit, who talks about, finding practical opportunities to take care of what you love. So that's people, it's communities, it's public institutions, it's private organizations. So to move towards those people, organizations, institutions that you really care about and contribute to them and protect and defend them. Now, I think the thing is there are probably many of those, and so you can't do them all. So I think you have to decide what's most important to me. And everyone will make their own decisions. So it's very unlikely that any institutions or organizations will be bereft of support, but you'll drive yourself crazy if you try to support and protect all of them.
It's hard to withstand a slew of chaos and confusion and just overall madness and wretchedness. But if you can figure out what you love, figure out that thing, that institution, that group, find the people that value that share your vision, and find the leaders in that area, in those groups, in those institutions, in those places, and connect with them and participate in what they're doing. And in your own sphere of influence, speak out. Speak out publicly. Speak out on social media. Speak out on YouTube. Speak where you can. Speak with your friends. Speak with your neighbors. Take the initiative to step out. Lean into the tension. Let that tension transform you into a better leader. And let that tension also transform other people. We underestimate how much just simply speaking in a public forum like this, like here I am on YouTube sharing this message, I think we underestimate just how much that can make a difference. If many of us do that, you could play out in a different form. Perhaps you speak to people in your community. Perhaps you call your congressman or your senator. I really do believe that speaking out publicly and sharing your story, your perspective, gives us a more complete picture of what's going on and allows us to better understand it, at least for those of us that want the truth and that want to understand the full story. One part about figuring out what my filters are and how I'm going to apply them has to do with my vision and what I see as the vision of America. So America's name is United States of America. And that at a high level captures the vision of America. United States of America. The opposite of that would be the divided states of America. So we have united and divided. But we don't want a unity that is simply compliance where we're in alignment, but we're not doing it because we believe in it. We're doing it because out of obligation or duty, but with an underlying resentment. What we want is true unity, which really requires open communication and clarity, as well as the ability for us to have the tough conversations and talk about the tough things we want to talk about. So I don't need you to agree with me. I'm okay if you disagree with me. But the context in which we disagree, I think, is vitally important. If I start calling you names and calling you an enemy and tearing you down and trashing you, then I am moving towards division and away from unity. Now, if we're having a conversation on the merits of content, hey, this is what I think, and here's the basis of why I think that, and here's what you think and the basis of that, and we're having a conversation to work that out, to create the outcomes that we both want, that's a different thing, and it could get heated and emotional, but that's very different than me having contempt for you and making you the villain, and then taking my tribe and my audience and sicking them on you to attack you and take power from you so that I can either have retribution or revenge. And so vision is a powerful thing. The United States is a powerful vision that we can all share. And we need to think about, am I embodying the spirit of division, or am I embodying the spirit of unity? And which one am I contributing to, and how can I better go about tackling that in a healthy way? Am I adding to the toxicity, or am I adding to the health of our society? And so within that larger vision, that's the vision, then the values within that and the anti-values or the anti-visions would be the opposite of these things. So we have the United States of America, which I believe is for responsible freedom. It's freedom based on a responsibility to my fellow neighbor, to those around me, to the people that live around me. As Jesus said, to love your neighbor. And he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, which is a story about loving your enemy. It's loving the person you don't want to love. It's loving the person you've villainized and treating them and helping them, even though you don't necessarily want to, or because perhaps you don't like them, or perhaps they've hurt you in some way. The contrast to that would be a sort of form of tyranny, which would be a lawless freedom, which essentially I want to be able to do and say whatever I want, and you can't tell me what to do. And that means I get away with anything. I'm not accountable. That is a form of freedom. I can do anything I want without any regard to the consequence it puts on you or anyone else. That's a tyrannical form of freedom. And so I believe with America, we're talking about a positive form of freedom and then a negative form of freedom. And we want to move towards the positive and away from the negative. The second idea that is fundamental to America in terms of how it's even structured is that we believe in shared power as a country. We believe that shared power is a bulwark against tyranny, and consolidating power, unaccountable power, is a dangerous thing we do not want. America was founded in response to the tyranny of the king, and so we declared our independence. And so if we become tyrannical and we consolidate power, we become the very thing that our nation was founded against. The shared power is structurally separated within the presidency. We have our Congress and the Senate, and we have the judicial system, which is the Supreme Court, as well as the legal system, all the way down to the local level. And then we have state power. And so power is physically and structurally distributed. We have multiple branches of government. We have multiple branches of the military. The states have their own branches of government, their own National Guard. And so raw power is distributed across the board. And that prevents any one individual from consolidating it and taking advantage of that power by eliminating their rivals and enacting retribution. So we got shared power as the second value, and then consolidated and unaccountable power as the anti-value. Then we have honest election outcomes, and then we have undermining and lying about election outcomes. Part of what makes a democracy a good system is it allows us to enact new leaders, to put new leaders in place. But if they're not good leaders, or they're not being responsible, or they're not sharing that power well, then we can replace them with better leaders. We can get rid of bad leaders and put in good leaders. But without an election system, we can't do that. Then we have a situation where someone is ruling, a terrible person is ruling, and they've set it up in a way that they cannot be removed without a lot of force, a lot of energy, and potentially a lot of violence. So this vision and these values informed how I went about advocating the last couple of years in my political activism, and why I ended up becoming a Christian and a Republican who advocated for supporting and voting for Kamala Harris. These were the values because I saw her as embodying these values, and I saw Trump as violating them. And so this is where it comes down to Trump was a below the water level threat. There were things I didn't necessarily agree with about Kamala Harris's approach to policy, but she was above the water. She believed and she embodied these values of the United States of America. Now that the election's over, Trump won, he is now the president. We're a few months into this, and now it's a matter of how do I look at this situation now? There really are two main things that I'm focused on. These are the below the waterline things. that I'm most concerned about and that I'm keeping an eye on and that I'm monitoring. So the first thing that I'm focused on is the consolidation of power and overriding elections. So I mentioned those two things and the virtues and values. When it comes to the 2020 election, that's what Trump did. He began undermining the 2020 election, spreading lies and deceptions, and he deceived millions and millions of people that the election was going to be stolen and that when it happened, because he lost, that it was stolen. And then after he went through all the legal proceedings to try and challenge all of the outcomes, he lost his countless court cases. He continued to propagate the lie that the 2020 election was stolen. And he attempted to consolidate state power and leverage his power to overturn the election results and stay in power even though he legitimately lost the election. And so when it comes to consolidating power and overriding elections, the 2020 election is the election to look at to see what Trump did. And that culminated in January 6th, where Trump was willing to leverage violence to allow things to unfold for 3 hours, to allow this violence and this attack, this storming of the Capitol, to unfold to help him stay in power. When you look at the 2020 election and the 2024 election, Kamala Harris lost the 2024 election and Trump lost the 2020 election. And if you look at how they both responded to that, the difference is night and day. Trump attempted to consolidate power. He lied about everything. And then he was willing to use violence. Whereas Kamala Harris told the truth about the election outcome, that Trump did win in 2024. She did not attempt to consolidate any power, and she conceded her loss. She was not willing to leverage violence like Trump was in order to change the outcome of the 2024 election. And the contrast between those two is really a powerful visual, I believe, to understand the difference between the two candidates and why I voted for Harris and why I didn't vote for Trump and why I was actively against Trump. As we look ahead to these next 4 years, in particular 2028, where the next election is going to happen, it's important and a helpful parallel for us to look at the situation that has unfolded in South Korea at the end of 2024. I'm going to read to you an article from Gwen Dyer. If you're unaware of what happened in December 2024, the South Korean president declared martial law and deployed the military in an attempt to grab power. So here's how Gwen Dyer describes how the population swiftly responded to protect their democracy. This is something I want us to be thinking about and aware of because this could be something we have to do. South Korean politicians and ordinary citizens both mobilized with admirable speed. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were in the streets in hours, while politicians of all parties headed immediately to the National Assembly. Even Yoon's own party condemned his actions. By Wednesday morning, enough politicians had struggled through the police lines to constitute a quorum. The police had tried to force their way into the building, but had been repelled by parliamentary officials. First, the members of the National Assembly canceled the martial law by unanimous vote, and then they voted to impeach the president. It was an exemplary defense of democracy, and South Koreans of all political colors should be congratulated for their actions. With the partial exception of many senior members of the military and police forces who largely obeyed Yoon's orders until he panicked and canceled them. It's a pretty incredible story that the population of South Korea responded in such a strong way, in a healthy way, and it's something that I hope for in America. I'm skeptical that the people around Trump or his loyalists are going to do anything other than whitewash and defend him and valorize what he's doing. They're going to see it as, this is wonderful, when in reality, he's consolidating power in a fog of confusion without communicating, with chronic mistakes along the way, and celebrated and encouraged by many Christians, unfortunately. I mean, one of Trump's first actions in office was to pardon the criminals and violent insurrectionists of January 6th. He let them all go. And that is an embodiment of the idea of the rule of lawlessness. Instead of a rule of law, there's opposite is a rule of lawlessness. And when you have a lawless president who's embodying that lawlessness and empowering and emboldening those that act lawlessly, it creates a chilling and ripple effect that just harms us as a society. Back to the Korean situation, I want to read one more quote from Gwen. There was a critical choice made by the military. What the South Korean military and police seem to have done in practice was to obey all of the president's orders up to, but not including, the use of lethal violence against the civilian population. which you may not have ordered in any case. So the military and police had to tread this line of following the orders of their president, but also not crossing these horrific lines that may have been asked of them. And that's one of the situations that I hope we don't have to deal with. It's been, reported by many outlets that during the 2020 riots and protests, Trump wanted and vocalized, can't we just shoot these protesters in the legs? He was willing to shoot these protesters. And so he talks about using violence against his enemies and retribution. He doesn't seem to have an issue with leveraging violence. After Ashley Babbitt was shot on January 6th, he waited for 45 minutes before he did anything. And he's continued to deny and blame others. He has not taken responsibility. And this goes back to the values. I want a Republican Party that embraces responsibility and takes responsibility for our failures. And that includes January 6th. And as a Republican, that event is one of the things I've decided to take responsibility for because no one in my party is willing to do it. Outside of consolidating power and overriding elections, the second thing that I'm paying attention to over these next 4 years is the defiance of the constitutional order. There have been a lot of things that Trump is doing, has ordered to be done through executive orders, and is trying to do that are unconstitutional, that are beyond the limits of the presidency, that are things he cannot do, that he is attempting to override congressionally passed laws and to do what he wants to do. Those have been pulled into the court system, which again is why it's important we have these separation of powers and branches of government, because if they didn't exist, Trump would have consolidated power and there would be very little we could do to stop him. But because we have these different branches of government, it prevents any one person from consolidating power and doing anything they want. So the thing to look for is when the judges start making decisions on these things and they decide and define that certain things that Trump is trying to do, wants to do, is doing, is unconstitutional, is illegal, is wrong, then and the thing I'm looking for is what does he do in response? How does he respond to the Supreme Court when they rule against him? The key is, will he submit to the Supreme Court rulings or will he defy them? And that is what I'm looking for, because if he's willing to defy them, the judiciary system has some things it can do to penalize people. There's very little it can do to the president, but the judiciary can financially penalize people, particularly people that have a lot of money. It can also use jail and other forms of imprisonment to punish them. So there are some things, but at the end of the day, if the president decides to defy Supreme Court, there is little that it can do to enforce it. Now, what we saw on January 6th is so many Republican leaders in Congress and the Senate were willing to go along with Trump's lies and participate in his corruption. And so are many of his loyal supporters. Now, on the flip side, many of those in the legal system were not willing to do that. And that's why we saw all the court cases that Trump brought. He brought them and he lost them. And the courts, including judges he appointed, including people that were Republicans and conservatives, they were not willing to go along with it. But the political leaders, they were willing to go along with the lies and deception. And so that means they're likely to go along with anything Trump might try to do again, whether it's in 2028, 2026, or anything else. This is a quick reminder. If we go back to American history, Americans had a civil war. When the South seceded, they didn't pass a law in Congress. They didn't have a Supreme Court ruling. The states just decided to secede from America. And there was no way to stop them other than by enforcing it. And that led to what we all know as the American Civil War. And so much of America's society, much of the United States of America, the vision, as we come back to that, is based on a voluntary participation in this rule of law system. But as this rule of law gets disassembled and lawness begins to prevail, that system begins to fall apart. And so I believe the biggest threat that America faces is to become the divided states of America in a form that essentially where the union is shattered in some fundamentally damaging and irreversible ways. God willing, these types of worst case scenarios won't unfold, but it does seem like it's inevitable that there are constitutional crises on our horizon. That's why it's one of the issues that I want to focus on. It's what I think of as a below the line issue. Now, for other issues, it may be not as dramatic or not as big. If you have a family member that is going to get deported, or if you have a family member that works in government that is losing their job, I mean, that's a big deal to that person and perhaps to the community around that person. And so those might be things that you want to focus on. Those might be issues you want to tackle. These are simply the things that I'm focusing on. I'm really trying to take a step back as a country and look at what are those high level concerning challenges. And those are the things I want to watch for. And those are the things that I want to be activated in speaking up and stepping in. When we give up, we give in. So speak up and step in.